spoke the world into existence. You're powerful in wondrous ways, laying out creation before our eyes. Yes, it may fade, but you forever stay the same. Holy, holy, awesome in glory. You are Lord over all, marvelous in majesty, all powerful, almighty. You are Lord over all. You are Lord over all. And here we stand before you, Father. Lead us to where we need to be. We offer up our lives, a living sacrifice. Yes, we will praise you, Lord, forever you will reign. Holy, holy, awesome in glory. You are Lord over all, marvelous in majesty, all powerful, almighty. You are Lord over all. You are Lord over all. You are holy. You are holy. We come to you before your righteousness. Your glory fills this place, and let our hearts be changed. We will raise our voice as one before you, God. Holy, holy, you're awesome in glory. You are Lord over all, marvelous in majesty, all powerful, almighty. You are Lord over all. You are Lord over all. Oh, you're the Lord over all. You're the Lord over all.
Psalm 62 says this: "For God alone my soul waits in silence, from him comes my salvation. He alone is my rock and my salvation, my fortress, and I shall not be greatly shaken." I want to encourage you to take a moment during today to pause, to wait on God, to remember that he is our strength and our salvation. That's reason to worship. And I hope that's part of what brought you here to our online worship service, just to remember and to celebrate God's strength, his salvation, his peace. This has been a busy and exciting week in the life of our church. We want to thank Jesse and Chelsea and their kids for coming out and getting to know us. And whatever direction God leads your family and our church, we want you to know that we've enjoyed getting to know you. And we look forward to what God will do through us and through you in the future. I also want to remind our church that we've got 24 hours of prayer being planned for Tuesday this week into Wednesday. So if you'd like to be involved in that, please send an email to the church service, or to the church office rather, so that we can plan it out, so that we have a time of prayer leading into this important decision that we're making. Again, thank you for joining our online service. God bless. Sometimes we have these moments in our life where we're just living in our sweet spot. Everything seems to go exactly as we planned it, maybe even better. At the golf course, you find your ball always in the middle of the fairway where you couldn't have placed it better if you laid it there with your own hand. The recipe turns out better than you could have even expected. You sit down at your desk to work and you find that the hours and the work, they just fly by. Everything you're doing seems to prosper. You climb into the tractor or the piece of machinery and it operates smoothly, like an extension of yourself, just like you would want it to. I've told you a story before of one of my days where I lived for a moment in my sweet spot. I know I've told you before, but I'm going to tell you again just because I like to look back on the memory. It came on the day of my commercial flight test. And most flight test days, the weather is miserable or questionable at least, but this day was calm and cool, a slight breeze down the runway, the air still steady in the early morning. And when I climbed into the plane, I found that it seemed to respond to my very thoughts. When the examiner asked for a short field takeoff, it was like the little Cessna. It leapt out of the starting blocks like a sprinter and obediently lifted into the air. When he asked for a soft field landing, those back wheels, they touched the ground with no more force than a feather landing on silk sheets. It was perfect. I did everything perfectly. And when I finally taxied clear of the runway and pulled the throttle back and the mixture knob back to bring the propeller to a stop, I turned and looked to the examiner, just waiting for him to reach out his hand and say, "Congratulations." But he didn't. He sighed and said, "So, how do you think that went?" Not as good as I thought, apparently. Life is full of surprises, isn't it? And it's amazing how quickly we can go from life in our sweet spot to wanting to follow the nearest earthworm into his hole because it's just miserable. The trusted recipe flops. Everything we touch seems to break down. The work stacks up. The day drags by. It's just miserable. From life in our sweet spot to miserable in the blink of an eye. It's surprising how this can happen. And perhaps in those moments, it's good to remember that the Bible is a book full of surprises. I know you've read it so many times that its edges have become soft and worn. It's as comfortable to you as a pair of Saturday jeans, but the Bible is full of surprises. Think about it for a moment. It's that man who fled to the wilderness, who's about to rescue Israel. Oh, before that, it's the woman who's been collecting old age pension for decades, who's pregnant. It's the boy who just showed up with a wagon load full of cheese and bread, who's about to step onto the battlefield and face down the giant. It's town, way out in the sticks, that is the home of the Messiah. It's that man there, hanging on the cross, suffering, bleeding, dying. That's the Messiah himself, God himself. The tomb where they had laid him, only hours ago, really, is empty. And he's alive. The Bible is full of surprises. So we shouldn't be surprised when all of history reaches its final point. And Jesus sits down as judge over all of us, that there is one last surprise. In Matthew chapter 7, Jesus says that on that day many will say to him, Lord, Lord, didn't we prophesy in your name and cast out demons in your name and do many mighty works in your name? And he will say, away from me, for I never knew you, you workers of lawlessness. One final surprise that's deeply personal, that affects every one of us. It's interesting that this final surprise, it isn't new. It's a theme that's played out over and over again on the pages of Scripture, that sometimes the people who think they know God the best don't know him at all. One of the places that it's played out is in the prophet Hosea in chapter 8. So let's read that whole chapter together, beginning in verse 1 and working all the way to the end, of course. Here it is, Hosea chapter 8. Set the trumpet to your lips. One like a vulture is over the house of the Lord, because they have transgressed my covenant and rebelled against my law. To me they cry, my God, we, Israel, know you. Israel, though, has spurned the good. The enemy shall pursue him. They made kings, but not through me. They set up princes, but I knew it not. With their silver and gold they made idols for their own destruction. I have spurned your calf, O Samaria. My anger burns against them. How long will they be incapable of innocence? For it is from Israel, the craftsman made it. It's not God. The calf of Samaria shall be broken to pieces. For they sow the wind, and they shall reap the whirlwind. The standing grain has no heads. It shall yield no flour. If it were to yield, strangers would devour it. Israel is swallowed up. Already they are among the nations as a useless vessel. For they have gone up to Assyria, a wild donkey wandering alone. Ephraim has hired lovers. Though they hire allies among the nations, I will soon gather them up. And the king and princes shall soon writhe because of the tribute. Because Ephraim has multiplied altars for sinning, they have become to him altars for sinning. Were I to write for him my laws by the 10,000s, they would be regarded as a strange thing. As for my sacrificial offerings, they sacrifice meat and eat it, but the Lord does not accept them. Now we will remember their iniquities and punish their sins. They shall return to Egypt. For Israel has forgotten his maker and built his palaces, and Judah has multiplied fortified cities. So I will send a fire upon his cities, and it shall devour her strongholds. My dad was fond of saying that hindsight is 20/20, believing that the proverb is generally true. Perhaps we should work our way backwards through this passage. And if we do, we begin to get a resume of Israel. We begin to get a picture of who Israel thinks they are. And we soon realize that they've been busy, awfully busy. They have built fortified cities, a sensible thing to do when a superpower is groaning and rumbling on their northern border. They've built palaces. They've not only focused on this part of life, but they've focused on the religious part of their life as well. They bring sacrifices to their God. They do this so regularly, so frequently, that they strike a committee, a building committee. They make plans. They receive tenders. And they build altars all over the place. Again, a sensible thing to do. Keep God happy when there's an enemy on your borders. They make allies, and they appoint kings and leaders. One soon gets the picture that Israel would stand back, look at all they've done, and say to God, Lord, are you not impressed? Fortified cities, sacrifices, altars, allies, kings, leaders, we are taking care of things. So perhaps it came as something of a surprise to them that God speaks through the prophet And the words he speaks are not words of thankfulness or appreciation or pleasure or at all the busyness that Israel's been engaged in. Instead, he gives them this picture that the Lord is like a vulture hovering over his house. You should know that it seems that the ancient Hebrews were not as specific in naming birds and animals in general as we are. So the word for vulture could equally well be translated as eagle. And in fact, in other places in the Bible, it is. As in Exodus chapter 19, when God says that he bore Israel out of Egypt as on eagle's wings. Or in the book of Deuteronomy, where God promises to be an eagle, a protection to his people. In other words, Israel, if obedient to the covenant, can expect God to be their eagle, their defender, their protector. That's important because here the imagery is reversed. God is hovering over his house, hunting, ready to strike, ready to pounce. In fact, Hosea goes on to say about the middle of the chapter that all of Israel's busyness is nothing more than sowing the wind. And in the world of poetry, that's not only useless, it's destructive. Because the one who sows the wind will reap a harvest. It'll be the whirlwind, flattening buildings, knocking down trees, wreaking absolute havoc. Lord, the Israelites say, look at all that we've done. We've prophesied in your name, and cast out demons in your name, and performed mighty works in your name. We've built altars and made sacrifices and built fortified cities and palaces and appointed kings and leaders and made allies. And God is not impressed with any of it. Because there's something missing. When a similar event plays out in Matthew chapter 7, when Jesus says, "Away from me, I never knew you," what he says is missing is obedience. Here in Hosea, the idea is that God wants to be remembered. He wants Israel to really know him, who he is. He wants them to know his covenant, to keep his covenant, to know his laws and obey his laws. Perhaps we could bring all of these ideas together under one simple word. That what God is really looking for from his people is faithfulness. What he's looking for from Israel is faithfulness. And if that's not there, then all of their religious activity is nothing more than a fig leaf trying to cover up their enormous lack. Maybe the same is true of us. It's so easy to present our resume to God and say, look at all we're doing. Why, if our church is fuller this week than it was last week, we must be doing things right. If the church calendar is fuller this year than it was last year, then we must be doing things right because we're busy. If we're giving our money and our time to particular places, if we're reading our Bible and praying, then we must be doing it right. We must be pleasing God. But time after time, people who think in that way in the Bible are surprised because God rejects their work as a mere fig leaf if there's no faithfulness. Perhaps something that has happened through this time is that our busyness, even our religious busyness, is being flushed away. And no longer can we hold up as evidence to God of our faithfulness our full church calendar, our full church on Sunday mornings, our Bible studies, whether it's for the men or the ladies or the youth. All those things are taken away. So what does faithfulness look like then? What does faithfulness look like now? When we can no longer hold these things up. I'd like to present to you 3 ideas from the book of Hosea that can begin to define faithfulness for us. And as we've been reading through this book together, we've encountered each one of these ideas, so they won't come as a surprise to you. The first idea is this: we remember who we are. We are God's bride. We are his people. We are his household. Therefore, to be faithful means to live not for ourselves, but for his glory, his reputation, his name. To be faithful is to remember who we are. To be faithful is to remember that we are the household of God. Next, we'll remember that in Hosea's time, the people had plenty of reason for fear. There is that great slumbering superpower that has begun to awake. And Israel began to organize her entire life around the fear of this superpower. They made allies and built cities and made sacrifices. And Hosea calls on them, instead of organizing their lives around fear, to organize their life around God. So we too must choose to reject all forms of fear. Whether it's fear of the virus or fear of the response to it, we live confidently because our trust and our hope is in God. Finally, faithfulness is to remember that God is the ultimate answer. We don't run from one faint hope to the next, from one proposed solution to the next. We don't, like Israel, go from Egypt to Assyria to Aram and back again, looking for something to get us through this. We turn to God as the ultimate and final answer. If we live like this, faithfully, as God's people, rejecting fear, looking to him as the ultimate and final answer, then there will be no surprises on the last day. Then there will be no surprises when we meet Jesus. We will hear, "Well done, good and faithful servant." Would you join me in prayer? Our Father in heaven, help us to live faithfully for your honor and glory. Amen.
Lord bless you and keep you. Make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord turn his face toward you and give you peace. The Lord bless you and keep you. Make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord turn his face toward you and give you peace. Oh, amen, 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 amen. The Lord bless you and keep you. make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord turn his face toward you and give you peace. Oh, amen, 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 amen. Amen, amen. May his favor go before you and 1,000 generations to your family and their children and their children and their children. May his favor go before you and 1,000 generations to your family and their children and their children and their children. May his favor go before you and 1,000 generations to your family and their children and their children and their children. May his presence go before you and behind you and beside you, all around you. He is with you, he is with you, he is with you in the morning and the evening, and you're coming and you're going and you're weeping and rejoicing. He is for you, he is for you. Oh, amen, 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 amen. Oh, amen, amen, amen. May his favor go before you and 1,000 generations to your family and their children and their children and their children.